Bakari, Akil, welcome to Built to Sell Radio.
Thank you, John.
It's great to have you here. You're in the business of buying companies, and obviously our listeners want to sell their company. And so today is really about trying to get inside your head from the lens of what do you look for? How do you structure deals when you go to buy a company so that our audience can understand, okay, from the acquirer's mind or from the acquirer's side, here's what they're looking for, here are the moves they're likely to make, et cetera. So walk us through how you got into the world of buying companies. Just take us through your journey.
So from my background, currently completed 2 acquisitions, completed 2 deals. The first is I bought a burlap bag manufacturing company in New Jersey called NYP Corp. I did that deal in partnership with a private equity firm. The company was around 30 million in revenue, a decent size of that in profits as well. Very successful business, owned by 2 brothers who were interested in making an exit. Actually, the business was founded in 1946, so it was their father's company, and they ended up taking it over themselves. The year before that, I completed an acquisition of an educational technology company. That one was around 30 million in revenue as well, around $3 million in annual profit. So another very successful company. And so that's been my background. Not only that, I also teach entrepreneurship through acquisitions. So I teach MBA candidates at Cornell how to go out and acquire businesses. And so, but all of this started really back in 2015. I was like 25 and I was broke, and I was asking myself, how do I get rich? And so I started reading every book I possibly could on a subject of wealth building. I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I read I Will Teach You to Be Rich by Ramit Sethi. Those 2 books convinced me that if I was going to become wealthy, I needed to get into entrepreneurship. So the 2 big books in entrepreneurship for me that were pointed were the E-Myth and Built to Sell. And so those are like my 2 Bibles as I was understanding the world of entrepreneurship, et cetera. And so,
okay, that's very generous, but I won't understand what happened between being broke in 25 and buying 2 $30 million companies. That's in the space of 8 years. There's a bit of a gap there I need to fill in.
Yeah. So what I learned in 2015 was that MBA candidates at Harvard and at Stanford were being taught by their professors how that a correct approach to entrepreneurship, or that a correct approach to entrepreneurship, was to skip the startup phase and to just look for an existing business that had done all of the things that you advocate that entrepreneurs do and Built to Sell. That they do, that a business that has already done those things, and instead of going and trying to create all that stuff on your own as a newly minted MBA, just to go out and buy that company. And that there are capital sources that are available for 25, 26, 27, 28-year-olds. Really, it's not dependent on your age, but that just exposing them to someone who's mature enough to understand how a business can operate, has already made a decision to go and study business at a prestigious business school, to go and do that work and find a company for sale. And so this was being taught really only at 2 schools. It was at Harvard Business School, and it was being taught at Stanford Business School. Now, I was a broke 25-year-old, and come to find out, they had just recently made it, exported this class to Columbia Business School. And I lived in New York City at the time, or I live in New York City, it's still, and I lived maybe 5 minutes away from Columbia Business School. And so I just went to the business school and I sat in the course where they were teaching the MBAs in New York how to buy.
You weren't registered?
I wasn't registered. I was not a student. I just sat in the class.
Who's the new kid?
Yeah, exactly. No one. In fact, it was the first day of class. Like, I went on the internet, found out when classes start. I sat in the class, and that was my introduction to how to do this in a formulaic academic place where I could ask the professor questions and interrogate other people who had done this successfully, the whole 9. And I just sat in the class, and that's how I learned.
Did you ever get caught?
Oh, yes. In fact, I got caught, and the professor was so impressed by the fact that I had made that decision that he started inviting me back to teach and lecture in his course about hustle and drive and motivation and, stick-to-itiveness and all this type of stuff to convince the MBAs who were in that class about, separate from the academic side of this thing, there is a meaningful amount of like just going after it. Like you got to go and get it done. And the idea that somebody would learn about this and say, hey, I'm just going to go to the business school. Like the business school's doors are not closed. It's like, you just go there. I was about the same age as any other MBA. I didn't stand out in some unusual way. So I sat down in the class and I learned how to buy companies. And that was the introduction to my, so a lot of like pre-learning through books like yours and others, and then actual academic training in the business school. And then I went out and started executing, and searching for companies to buy. And now, years later, I'm the guy who actually has the students and teaches them how to do it as well.
And so you're actually now a professor of entrepreneurship?
My title would be more accurately a visiting lecturer. So I have a class inside of a larger course that's taught at Cornell's Business School. And in that class, I teach the MBAs how to buy companies. And
what do you teach them?
So the first thing I think MBAs and just really anybody who doesn't come from wealth, like I don't come from any wealth. In a previous podcast, I was talking to somebody and I had a friend who was doing this type of work. And I think at the time he probably had a net worth of around $5,000. And he was probably the richest person I knew at that time. like we didn't have no money. And so I think it's such a frame break and such a dramatic thing to tell somebody who does not have a lot of money, really any major significant net worth, that instead of starting a business, which most people will tell you should start a business if you want to become wealthy, that you should just skip that and buy it. Because the first question is, where do I get the money? How am I supposed to afford buying a company? And in fact, that's how I start my course. As I say, I start my class and I say, entrepreneurship acquisition, you should buy a company. What's the first thing you think about? And then the MBAs all pop up and they all say the same question. How am I supposed to afford that? I have business school loans. Like, where does this money come from? and that's, you're talking about buying a company. And so I think ultimately getting the MBAs to recognize that there is an enormous amount, and by enormous amount, it's hard to overstate the amount of money that exists in the world that is specifically focused on finding great businesses, many companies that are similar to the types of businesses that your audience have created already, particularly if they followed the blueprint that you wrote about in your book. If they do exactly the steps that you list in your book, there is so much capital that exists in the world specifically designed to acquire those businesses and keep them operating and running for the future and ultimately sold again.
So let's get practical. So I'm one of your students. I'm at Cornell, and you're teaching me where to find the money. So I'm like, I don't have whatever it costs to buy a $30 million company. I don't have anywhere close to that. So give me how do I raise the money to do this?
Right. So the first thing I like to do is I try to frame the type of company that I think that is most appropriate for an MBA to acquire. The first step I think is that there are size limits that the market has made possible for people of our backgrounds to attract and to execute against. The first I would say is that there's a minimum revenue amount of at least $1 million. You can find a company that generates at least $1 million in revenue. That's the beginning. But I would say as a high point, you probably don't want to go over $10 million. That said, I bought 2 companies that had 3 times that amount. My situation ended up being a little more unique. That said, I have friends and friends and friends and a large community of people who have done this exact approach that I'm about to outline here, which is $1 to $10 million in revenue. That's about the size that you want to focus on. This means this is a company that's not a startup. They haven't just gotten into business. But it's also not so large that Coca-Cola is the main appropriate acquirer, right? You're not getting calls from, that company's not getting calls from Apple and Google. Instead, they're getting calls from people like me who could put together the capital financing to complete a transaction of that size. The second thing would be a minimum EBITDA amount. And by EBITDA, I mean annual profits or your earnings before interest, depreciation, taxes, and amortization. Now, this number is sort of seen as the holy grail in the private equity space and the M&A space. That if that number is at least $1 million, you're now in a space where you can attract capital, both from individuals and from larger institutions, like private equity firms, like family offices, more traditional, wealthy people, right? The second thing that you also have access to is you have access to a certain set of banks that are willing to finance these transactions. About 70% of the acquisition is going to probably come from a lender. The big thing that I introduce to the students that I speak to is this is a leveraged buyout in this old classical sense, the 1980s style. This is we're going to use a decent amount of debt financing to complete these transactions, and so the lenders make up the majority of that conversation. And so there are lenders like Live Oak Bank and Byline Bank and many others that focus exclusively on giving, or not exclusively, but have departments that are dedicated to making these types of transactions happen because they have a guarantee coming from the government. So it's funny. I was in Cape Town, South Africa last month, or actually 2 months ago, and talking to a bunch of private equity professionals out there. And I was explaining to them exactly what I'm explaining to you. And it blew their minds because outside the United States, what I'm about to explain is considered like crazy. But the federal government gives a guarantee through a program called the 7A program, which guarantees to the bank their loan. It completely guarantees it. So if we buy a company using money from the bank and we go bust, the government will repay that loan completely to the bank, which makes the loan essentially for the bank no risk. Now, of course, they need to do due diligence and all that to make sure that the government sees that they actually reviewed this business. But for the most part, it's a risk-free loan that the bank can give out to people who want to go buy companies, and that loan can go up to 90% LTV, or loan to value. So you can get 90% of a proposed transaction from the bank. So we're talking a company, let's say, using the example I just gave, let's say that we attract a business that's making $4 million in annual profits and $4 million in revenue and $1 million of annual profits. Generally speaking, those businesses trade for around 3 to 5 times their annual profits. So let's say we buy that company for $4 million, or we've agreed with the seller. He owns a business that generates $1 million annually in profit. He'll sell the company for $4 million. We go to the bank. We can borrow up to 90% of the purchase price directly from the bank. So now we have to come up with 10% of $4 million, which is $400,000. Now, $400,000 is a lot of money, but it's a lot different than coming up with $4 million. And what are we talking about from a risk position? We're trying to track certain types of companies, businesses that have been stable for years, that have a lot of the criteria that you outlined in your book, John, which are, no major customer concentration. We're not trying to buy a company that has one customer that represents everybody, or that has a key man risk where all the customers come directly from the relationship that the seller has with them. And so we try to find a good business that can operate exclusive from the owner. And that puts us in a position where we can buy that company, borrow some of the money from the bank. And let's assume for a second that we don't borrow any money from the bank. We just straight up buy the company for $4 million. For some reason, I'm talking to some super duper wealthy person who just has $4 million in the bank. They buy the company for $4 million. They just put that up. If business continues operating just as it's been operating for the future, and meaning it continues to generate at least $1 million in annual profits, they get 25% of the money that they've invested into that company back every single year. So within 4 years, they get all of their money back for operating that company, assuming nothing else has changed. That's a 25% return.
You're referring to the $1 million in profit.
Exactly.
Of EBITDA.
Exactly right. That's a 25% return. Where can you get a 25% return right now in the market? Nowhere. The stock market's at 8%, right? And so so when you add in leverage, you're only amplifying that because you're reducing the amount of money that you're bringing in to $400,000. Now that's your capital base. You're bringing in $400,000 for a business that generates $1 million. Now let's talk about the loan. You have a $3.6 million loan, right? Yep. So you take that $3.6 million loan, let's put a 10% rate on it. So 10% of that is what you're paying to the bank every single year. So you take $360,000 and subtract that out of the $1 million that you're making in annual profits. So you put up $400,000 and that's how much money that you have left. 1 million minus $360,000. So now you've gotten all of the equity back that you invested in this company in 1 year. And still you have an existing asset that's generating money year after year after year after year. That simple explanation, when you put that in front of just an average investor, a person who has something like $100,000, $200,000, and a combination of their 401k, their savings account, et cetera. When you explain that simple thing, that's not a difficult thing to explain to them why you should give me 40 grand so that I can buy this company, particularly if you know the person. And then there are professional investors, and that's where my $30 million deal happened, et cetera. Family offices, large professional private equity firms that will partner with an investor like me and say, hey, we understand exactly what you just said. Here's the money to complete that transaction. And so that's really the opportunity that's been been explained both and operated and been successful for almost a decade now.
Okay. So I understand the very kind of simplistic example, the $4 million company, the SBA, Small Business Administration loans, called the 7A in the United States, is coming in with 3.6 million of that, or 90%. That sounds high to me. Is that common that the SBA would go all the way to 90%? Under what conditions would it go all the way to 90%?
So what I would say is what's more common as a number is to look at the EBITDA number and multiply it by 2.5 times. And that's roughly what you'll get from a bank standard. But then there are lenders who do what we do. They partner with entrepreneurs who are looking to buy companies in this manner, and they consistently do somewhere between 80 and 90% of the financing. And so that's why I mentioned groups like Live Oak Bank, Byline Bank, and others. And you can find that. So there's a resource. And now I feel like I'm running the risk of convincing your audience to say, "Hey, let me go buy a company."
yeah. But creating some competition there.
But so there's a resource called searchfunder.com, and it's a community of people who are just like me who go out and buy companies, and the lenders, the investors, people who help on due diligence, people who help on all parts of this acquisition process. In the lower middle market, which is what we define businesses that generally make less than $50 million in revenue, we refer to that as the lower middle market as opposed to the middle market, which is much higher than that. There's an entire community of service providers, investors, lenders, and entrepreneurs, and we call them entrepreneurs through acquisition, who are active in this space, who share their experiences, their tips, and their support for people who are looking to buy companies.
Got it. So let's go back to this $4 million business as an example. So what would be common for an SBA loan, like from a Live Oak or Byline, or two of the leading SBA lenders in the United States, they would say, okay, we'll do 2.5 times EBITDA. So in this case, it'd be 2.5 million. Where's the other $1.5 million coming from?
Almost none of them are completed without some form of seller financing, meaning the seller himself will provide a loan for the business to be acquired. And so let's assume a $4 million transaction, $2.5 million you get from a bank. You ask the seller, you would ask for, let's say, somewhere in the area of $1 million. Maybe the seller says no to $1 million, but let's say it's somewhere in the area of $500,000 to $1 million. That's where you get that. And that leaves the $500,000 as the final piece of equity that you need to bring into the transaction. And that ultimately you break up against maybe 10 investors who you ask each for $50,000. And so these are people you've worked with, people who you are in the community, people who know you and trust you. And that's where you pull in that capital. Or you do what I've done, which is to go out to larger capital sources like family offices and private equity firms to complete those sides, to pull in that large size.
I get this totally. We've got a couple more questions. So we got a $4 million business, 2.5 from an SBA loan, $1.5 million left to finance. Of that, let's say $1 million from the seller, $500K you got to raise. So you break it out into 10 equal and 10 tranches of $50K, 10 different investors.
Right.
The $50K, what's in it for them? Like, do they get equity in the deal? Are they like a limited partner? Or like, what's the legal structure there?
Yeah. So when I'm talking to guys who reach out to me about this sort of approach, and I ask them, who are they thinking about talking to that $50,000 from? Are they talking to the super sophisticated investor who wants to know about their IRRs and their MOIC, and what's the weighted average return? And, you know, they're asking all of those types of sophisticated questions. Then there are certain things that you need to be able to hit for that investment, right? First, you need to be able to hit is at least an 8% annual return, because the bar there, any sophisticated investor is going to look at is the S&P 500's return on capital. That's a quote unquote at least close to non-risky return. So they're going to look at the S&P 500 and say, can you at least return 8% of my money over the course of X period? But no investor is going to say, well, because you gave me 9%, I'm going to be willing to do this deal, because they're going to say that S&P gives me 8. Wow, that 1% premium doesn't matter to me at all. And so in the private equity world, we generally look at something in the area of 30% for these sort of transactions. You need to be able to return all of their capital plus 30%. And so whatever sort of structure that you use to be able to provide that return, either you return most of their capital in the first year, which is what I described in the first example, by amping up the leverage and bringing down the amount of equity that you needed. You, because there's so much capital still available, you can amplify that return by returning that capital early. And so you can do trade-offs with the equity amount or an increase, a quicker return that reduces. But ultimately, that's sort of like the working within the confines of a sophisticated investor's understanding of how capital should be returned to them for participating in your transaction. And I frankly think that more people should want to have those types of investors in their business, because they will bring, just by the nature of who they are, a rigor that will force you as an entrepreneur who owns that company to be very intelligent in how you manage that business, because you know you're going to have somebody who's holding you accountable to what you put into that language. But that said, more often than not, who are you going to actually go to that money, right? If you are in your late 40s, early 50s, you've been running a company for 20 years, you know people in your personal community who are friends with you, who have built a significant net worth. You know family members who are also have that net worth. You may have a father-in-law, mother-in-law who also has that sort of net worth, who can afford to give you $50,000 and not be so sophisticated on the numbers. That said, you got to go to church with that person on Sunday. You know, you got to show up to Thanksgiving. You got to see that person in the community. You know, this is who you're borrowing that money from. And they don't see it as they invested in that capital. They see it truly as, you asked me for some money so that you can buy a company. And now I loaned you that money. Even if they are truly an equity investor in your business, they're not going to see it that way. They're going to see it as, I am a part of the loan structure of your business. And if you are not being ethical in the way that you are returning that capital back, if you are going through bumps and hiccups, and actually it doesn't even need to be unethical. It could just be, you bought a good company, but it has problems that are resulting in it just being a little bit more difficult for you to justify returning capital at this particular point in time. Maybe you plan to in 18 months, but it's just not practical for you to do that now. But these people who you've raised capital from, they don't understand that when they're sitting across from you at the dinner table. What they understand is, hey, John asked me for $30,000 and he has not given me that money back. And it's been 2 years. Where am I getting that money back? And that's all they're going to hear. They don't care about the weighted cost of return. Da, da, da. And even if you give them their money plus a return in the future, you still might have some difficulties. And so that's the sort of, I think more often than not, when you're going after businesses of this size and this sort of thing, that's the type of people who you're going to likely interact with as you're raising capital, particularly if you're the type of person who I just described, somebody in their late 40s, early 50s, who has access to that sort of network. If you're my age, as I mentioned, when I was coming at this thing at 25, I didn't know anybody who had real capital. Everybody I knew had a couple $1,000s. We were all hustling, trying to, make it happen for ourselves at that age. And so for those at that time, I needed to pursue more higher investors who had a much more rigorous understanding of what they were looking for from a return profile.
Which is where we get into $30 million type deals, more sophisticated.
Exactly right.
I want to stick with the smaller deal right now because this is interesting and again, probably very important for our listeners to hear. So you go to friends and family, you're asking for $50,000. And did I hear you right in saying a kind of a hurdle rate might be a 33.0% return in a year, 18 months kind of thing? Like, is there a time frame that you think is there? Yeah. So
the internal rate of return, which is a combination of time and money, if you start returning capital in year 1 and year 2, your internal rate of return is going to be far higher than 30%. And so if that's your plan, you don't even need to think about internal rate of return. Like you've already solved the problem. Most of us, when we're talking about that IRR number, and by internal rate of return, that's what I mean by IRR. That's usually over the course of 5 years. So at the end of a 5-year period, you return all of their capital plus a 30% premium. What I would say is, again, that's for the sophisticated investor who recognizes that's the type of return that they want. If you're planning to try to return capital in the first year, you don't worry too much about that. At that point, it might just be more practical steps when you're talking to investors to talk about the raw numbers. You're going to give me $50,000. I'm going to give you $60,000 back in 1 year, right? You're going to get $10,000 on your $50,000
in the first year. I just want to understand, you mentioned that this is debt, and you drew the distinction that like friends around the Thanksgiving table aren't probably going to be super sophisticated and won't really understand the difference between debt and equity. They're going to say, I gave you $50,000, I want my 60 back. and I get that, but I'd be curious to know the structure, like when it's papered in a legal document, is it debt or is it a convertible note or is it equity? Like what's the structure?
There are some close to standard things, which is first, the person in the company will more often be referred to as an LP, so that so they will be a true owner of equity in the business.
A limited partner.
A limited partner. So the LP will be a preferred equity owner in the business, meaning more often than not, me, when I'm putting together this transaction, will live in the common equity of the business. And I'll have certain rights that come along with that common equity ownership of the business. But the preferred equity of the business will have a certain level of rights that include that when money is distributed, it first has to return capital to that preferred stack before it makes it to the common. So if I make a distribution of $100,000 out of my business, but I have a preferred ownership stake that represents $120,000, and that money needs to be paid out before it breaks out to the common ownership of the business. And so it acts similar to debt. It's not going to be, it's not above the senior debt. If we're using a funnel, senior debt's up here. First money out has to go to the senior debt. Next money would be the seller note. Third money would be the preferred equity. And then the last money would be the common equity. And your investors would be partial owners of both, will be full owners of the preferred equity tranche, but the bottom, they'll partner together with you in that tranche. So you have to satisfy the preferred equity amount that you've guaranteed. Hey, you gave me $50,000. I'm going to give you $60,000 back. You have to fulfill that. And then once you fulfill that, then you as an owner in the common, along with them, will participate on a pro rata share of what that amount is. And so let's say you've negotiated a deal where they get their $60,000 out in the first year. And then down here in the comment, they are 20% of the owners and you're 80% of the owner. So after they get their money back, now going forward, it's 80-20, 80-20, 80-20.
Got it. That's super helpful. Did I hear you say the seller's note would sit right
above? Yeah, it would sit above the preferred, but it would not be above the senior debt. And the senior debt would make it absolutely clear to the seller that number will stay there.
Yeah. So folks know the term senior debt, like the bank effectively that's lending the $2.5 million in this fictitious example that we're describing here would sit first. And then the owner who put up the $1 million would sit second, and then the preferred shareholders and then the common shareholders. That's effectively the structure.
And to really explain, to further emphasize that point that I made about the, sitting around the dinner table conversation, the senior lender, the bank, has the ability, as a result of its loan contract, to turn off payments to the seller, to turn off payments to the preferred, and to prevent the common from receiving any distributions. And so this is sort of what I mean by when you're sitting down at the dinner table and your friend is asking you for that, when am I going to get that $60,000? And you say, well, the senior note has a contract that says that I'm not able to make any distributions. These are the types of things that they will not understand or care about. You own the company. Why can't you give me money? The situation. Those are the types of situations that can become sticky.
Yeah, I would imagine. Couple questions. Who guarantees the SBA loan? So
that's actually a very good question.
I know the government backstops the SBA loan, which enables folks like Wells Fargo and Live Oak to do what they do.
That's right.
But there's also someone else who guarantees the $2.5 million, correct?
That's right. You, the potential acquirer of that company, will fully guarantee that loan up to the full amount of your asset. And so that is a consideration that anyone considering pursuing an SBA loan should be aware of, is that loan is fully secured by all of your assets. The second piece about that is that the obvious next question would be, so what about the investors who you're asking to participate in that transaction? And they, to some degree, can be sheltered from that guarantee by keeping their ownership stake below a certain threshold. And that threshold is 20% ownership of the company, which is why I mentioned in the comment that they would that split would be 80-20. So that's where the LPs. Now, you can have as many LPs as you want in that common bucket. As long as they stay below 20%, they will never trigger the necessity for a guarantee.
So that's really important for our listeners to understand as well. In particular, those in the United States where this would be relevant. But most countries have, there are different programs. I'd encourage folks outside of the United States to look into how acquisition entrepreneurship is being executed in your country. Obviously, the U.S. is probably the most mature in this space, but there are others. So the $2.5 million in the senior debt is guaranteed by the acquisition entrepreneur. My understanding as well is that if the seller rolls more than 20% of his or her equity, that they too would be asked to guarantee the $2.5 million senior note. Is that your understanding as well?
So up until very recently, sellers were unable to own equity in the company after if they agreed to sell the company. They were allowed to have a seller note, but they were not allowed to have any equity in the business as a requirement to participate in an SBA loan. Recently, and I think as recent as this year,
I think it's got like a month ago or something like that. Yeah.
Right, that's changed. That said, the majority of my experience with the SBA has been under the concept of they're not being allowed to use seller equity, and so I wouldn't be able to answer the question as to the nuances of that change.
Okay. Yeah, I think what my understanding of the rule, and again, it may change. It may have, I think it changed about a month ago, but my understanding is if you as the seller of the business roll more than 20% of your equity to somebody into a new entity that you've agreed to acquire you could be effectively have to personally guarantee the debt that the senior lender is taking on to underwrite the transaction. So that's something you should be really well aware of if that's in fact what you plan to do. But now we're getting into stuff that's way beyond my pay grade. So I just encourage everyone to kind of talk to a professional when it comes to that. But suffice to say,
one last thing.
Go ahead.
One last thing, and I appreciate that we're having a lot of conversation about the leverage piece of this.
Yeah,
because leverage is a very important and interesting tool.
And it's the name leverage buyout.
Exactly right. And I think a lot of times when we talk about this world of acquisitions and all this, we leave out the conversation on leverage, even though that takes up the majority of the capital approach. It's the biggest part of the conversation, And so it's funny that, most people, when they talk about this, they focus so much on the equity and raising the investor money. But understanding the debt markets is really important. That said, the SBA is but one of the lenders in the lower, or one program in the lower middle market that has certain criteria. But there are other lenders who operate in this world that don't have the same requirements that the SBA have. And because they operate in this world, they have other trade-offs that you'll have to be aware and consider. But just because there is a guarantee requirement and you may find that to be offensive and be unwilling to participate, that does not mean that there's no other debt access in this market. In fact, the first time that I ever received a commitment letter from a bank was not from a lender who had an SBA guarantee connected to it. And so there are options for loans in this space that don't have that option as well.
I want to get to that because I want to go to the larger size deal because it falls sort of outside of the scope of what we've talked about. But just to kind of put a pin in this $4 million deal, which again is very much in the kind of wheelhouse of a lot of our listeners. You as the acquisition entrepreneur, the 25-year-old MBA who's putting this whole kind of thing together, you are personally guaranteeing everything. And
at least if you use the SBA loan. Yeah.
The SBA loan. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And again, as a 25-year-old MBA, like who cares? You got nothing. So, you're like, it's not a big deal. If you're a 55-year-old entrepreneur and you happen to like the idea of acquiring, and you built some net worth, you may want to think about that and personal obligation you're taking on.
And that's why I want to emphasize that there are, and here's another piece is that oftentimes when I went to look for a loan for a company that I was looking to buy, I just went to the lender that was already familiar with the business. And so if you have a lender who you already work with, who provides you with working capital lines of credit, et cetera, they have a program inside of their bank more often than not to provide you with a loan to go out and acquire another company. And if that exists, then they may also be willing to sidestep the SBA program. You do not have to, a bank does not have to use the SBA program to provide a loan. It's completely optional on their part. And if you are a customer of choice, a consistent payer of your bills, there are many banks that would be willing. In fact, banks are in the business of lending money. And so they'd be very willing to participate and work with you if that's
Bakari, it's so funny because I've literally just launched an episode or released an episode last week, I think, by the time this one goes live, where an entrepreneur built a wonderful business, 7-8 million top line, $3 million of EBITDA. And she leveraged the entire thing up and borrowed mezzanine debt at 13 or 14%. I can't remember the exact. She pledged the entire business she created, this business with $3 million of EBITDA, to guarantee the debt, the mezz debt, and wrote a personal guarantee. And I pushed her on it because to me that sounded almost foolhardy. Like it sounded so risky because again, she built this company that had value. In this case, it, you know, even if you take 5 times 3 million of EBITDA, it's a $15 million business. She's putting, you know, chips on the table.
That's right.
Plus a personal guarantee, everything she's got in the world to go. I don't have the stomach for it.
Me either.
Like you've done this. So like, how did you get comfortable with that idea?
So that's it. So this story of people levering up and taking everything to the tilt has been told to me before, and including, you know, probably the most prestigious example of this is Elon Musk, right? That was the story of SpaceX and Tesla. That said, I was willing to make that decision when I was 25, and in fact, the biggest heartbreak of my life was getting enormously close to completing a transaction. In fact, the one that I mentioned before, where I had the commitment letter from a bank. This one did not have the SBA loan portion to it, but the bank itself was absolutely forcing me to guarantee the loan. There was no question of that. So yes, I was guaranteeing that loan. For me, the calculus was the same, which is that at that point I was about 28, 29, and I wanted to own a company, and this was a great business that I found and pursued, and it found a great multiple, and found a lot of parts about the company that gave me a great sense that it was defensible. And for me as an acquirer, and this now gets into my personal preference, is I like businesses that are defensible, where that COVID itself couldn't shake this business. And so, for instance, the company that I'm talking about is a label paper manufacturer. So basically, when you go to the supermarket to get like a sandwich or a soup from the fresh prepared food section, you know, they'll put it on the scale, they'll print out a label, you take the label to the cashier to pay for it. This company provides supermarkets with the printers, and then provides label paper to them on an ongoing basis. So here's a business that sits so small in the P&L chart of any supermarket owner that if he's looking to make cuts, he's not looking at label paper for his printer. That's not the place for the cuts. You know, he's gonna be pretty good there. And so had around 700 different accounts providing label paper, the small little line item on the company. Company was generating something at the point $1.5 million in EBITDA, and negotiated a price of around 4 to 5 times for the business. Got the bank to loan me the money to buy the company. And as I mentioned, this is the biggest heartbreak of my life, that the seller at the very last minute pulled out of the transaction and ultimately sold the company to its competitor. And since then, that company has been traded at twice. And I was working on that transaction just before COVID. And this is what I mean by COVID invincible. When the next year in 2020, every other business in the world shut down except for supermarkets. So
and the labels
keep getting printed. You know, so nice, stable, steady business.
How did that deal fall apart? You mentioned an acquirer approached them. I'm assuming the acquirer had better terms or was willing to pay more.
Yeah. So ultimately, the struggle on that transaction came down to an acquirer offering a higher purchase price. Now, generally speaking, the solution to this problem is to have a letter of intent that's ironclad. What I had decided to do in the middle of this transaction was to pause the letter of intent because I was working on something with the bank. And ultimately, that was the worst decision that I ever made in my life. So let me talk about letter of intent. A letter of intent is the legal document that defines the deal between me and the person who owns the company. And we call that colloquially an LOI. The letter of intent, the most important clause in a letter of intent is the exclusivity period clause, which allows you, generally speaking, about 90 days as the buyer to work on that transaction. And during due diligence, we found so many different unique issues with this company. It was a great business, but there were so many different unique issues with the business that it required me to work out some specific things to solve with the lender. And so during that time period, I told the seller, listen, I don't want to be offensive to you and force you to stay off market while I work out these issues with the lender, which was the lender that I wanted to work on in this transaction. I'll allow you to I'll remove the exclusivity period, but I'll be back to you within 2 weeks. And during that 2 weeks, the seller, in his concern that I may not come back, reached out to the competitor, and they offered more money than I was willing to pay.
When you sign a letter of intent, how formal is what level of confidence do you have that you've got a bank that's willing to do the deal?
So I will not sign a letter of intent with a business owner where I have structured a deal that I know is not financeable. And I've been in this game since 2015. I know what financeable deals look like, and I know what non-financeable deals look like. There are oftentimes unique nuances that a specific business may have that can change and these are things that I won't know ahead of letter of intent, because these things require deep due diligence into companies. And so while going through diligence, there may be things that pop up. But generally speaking, I'm never going to sign a letter of intent with somebody who I'm working on a transaction that is not financeable. An example of a not financeable deal would be, let's say I'm talking to the owner of a company who has $1 million EBITDA, and we're talking about him selling the company to me for $10 million. That on its face, unless it's a very fast growing technology company with an enormous amount of monthly recurring revenue, more often than not, it would not be financeable. I wouldn't sign that deal with the owner of a landscaping and snow removal company. More often than not, I would sign that deal with a 4 or 5x multiple on that. So that means a purchase price is somewhere in the $4 or $5 million range on $1 million in EBITDA, not 10 million. And if I did sign that, I would. If somebody did sign a $10 million number on a $1 million EBITDA, you would know that they probably would not be able to finance that deal.
Yeah. And for my listeners' benefit, know that almost always a letter of intent, or what Bakari is referring to as an LOI, is non-binding, meaning either party can usually cancel the agreement without any sort of form of recourse from the other side. There are examples where there is breakup clauses and so forth, but in most cases in the slower mid-market, LOIs can be canceled effectively without either side having to owe one another anything. And so this was within your rights to break this LOI because you weren't able to get financing. But from our listeners' perspective, if you're going to agree to an LOI, you're going to want to make sure that whoever you're doing the transaction with, you feel confident they can raise the money they say they can. Obviously, that's going to be an important piece of your due diligence as the seller.
At the same side, oftentimes when sellers are working on transactions, they know parts of their business that we as acquirers may not know. And there are businesses, as I mentioned, this business was a great company, but there are things that will pop up in due diligence that can change the whole nature of how we think about our ability to finance a transaction, and can spook a bank and spook other investors. And so you should be also aware that you can extend your due diligence period and extend the time of completing that transaction when you have these types of things pop up that you haven't disclosed before the seller or before the buyer starts working on trying to buy your company.
Yeah, you don't want any skeletons in the closet being kind of discovered during due diligence for lots of reasons. Just walk me through very briefly the $30 million type of transaction you referred to. So much larger. How is a $30 million deal that you would do different than, say, a $4 million deal?
Sure. So more often than not, what I'm going to have to do on a transaction that size is it's too large for me to do what I just mentioned, which is, go out to different people and ask them for $700,000 each. That 10 people give you $700,000. We can rule the world. So in that case, I need to reach out to professional organizations that provide capital for acquisition. So the company that I acquired, NYP Corp, which is a burlap bag manufacturing company, I reached out to a what's called a small business investment corporation that has around $400 million of assets under management, meaning they've raised $400 million for the purpose of acquiring companies, likely in partnership with folks like me who have done the work of sourcing and negotiating a great deal with a motivated seller, has defined a growth plan for the company. So it's not just, brokering the deal, but also managing and operating that company alongside the day-to-day managers of the company. So that's what I do as what's called an independent sponsor, where on a daily, weekly basis, interacting with the management of the company to execute the growth plan that I introduced to the private equity firm, the small business investment corporation that I partnered with to complete the transaction. And so on that deal, I put together the financing from them. I hired the CEO who operates and runs the company on a day-to-day basis, put together the growth plan, negotiated the deal with the sellers, and then worked in partnership with the private equity firm to evaluate and complete the transaction.
So how does that, to the extent that you can share, how does it break down? So of the 30 million, what chunk was debt? What chunk was equity from the Small Business Investment Corp? Can you walk through any of the kind of details there, the proportions?
So because NYP Corp is an operating business and operates within a competitive set, it's going to be hard for me to talk very openly about specifics as it relates to that company. What I can say is certain SBICs operate both as debt and equity providers. And so instead of having to raise both the equity from equity from one source and separately raise debt from another source, you can go to one firm that can provide all of that capital. And so the deal operates exclusively between you and that firm. And then there are other firms that operate very similarly, where they'll provide the debt, but they'll only provide a portion of the equity, and you have to raise your portion of equity separate from that. And so there are different nuances in how the SBIC program works. It's similar though to the SBA world, where the SBIC, they actually, the way they are able to raise money is they raise, let's say $100 million, and then the Small Business Investment Corporation matches that money. I think it's actually 2-to-1. I could be wrong, but I think it's like 2-to-1. And so $100 million in just pure cash that was raised from the private equity firm plus $200 million. And that comes to $300 million. And so there's many, many firms. This goes back to what I said at the beginning. There are many firms that are sitting on this type of capital, and it needs to be deployed into small businesses.
Okay. And I appreciate we can't talk specifically about the burlap bag deal. So maybe we can just talk generally on a larger deal where the SBIC is coming in. They, let's say it's a $30 million transaction. They might be good for both a tranche of debt and a tranche of equity.
So not just a tranche in the sense of like a portion. They may be representing the entire equity check.
Got it. Okay. And then that debt, again, as the acquisition entrepreneur, would you guarantee personally the debt the SBIC is taking on? No. What's the recourse the SBIC has on that debt if it doesn't get paid?
So in this case, they both own the equity and the debt on the business. And so their recourse is themselves.
Got it. They would. Right. I see. And so in that case, in a typical $30 million deal, is there any seller financing involved?
There can be. And it can be substantial. It can be small. It can be, at that point, this goes back to that point I made before, which is all relationships are, they shift and change based on the realities that are at play. Not only is there seller financing on the table, but this is where more often than not, you're actually going to see seller equity on the table, where the seller is going to roll a portion of their financing back into the company.
Okay.
And in this case, there's a huge incentive to do that because as a seller, you're not participating with just like, a acquisition entrepreneur who's going to sort of wing it and make it happen. You're participating with the acquisition entrepreneur who understands sort of the growth story, but you're also backed by a huge capital source. And so if there are initiatives that need to happen, if there are, there's just capital there that is excited to help make the transaction as much of a success. And a big portion because they don't only own a portion of the equity, if not all the equity, they also own a decent amount of their debt.
Got it. I've heard this independent sponsor label, and we've today used this acquisition entrepreneur label. Are they synonyms?
No, not in the way that they present themselves in real life. I like to think of myself as an acquisition entrepreneur, and I resist the label an independent sponsor, generally speaking. That said, and to define the two, I would say an acquisition entrepreneur is somebody who's interested in buying a company and running it full time as CEO. And so they are only in the acquisitions game for the purpose of finding one company. And if they find another company to buy after they bought their first company, it's usually in service of the first company that they bought. They're looking to just build that company up. That's the label that I've found myself most associated with, because when I speak with the business owner, that's generally speaking that's the story that I'm saying, which is I'm interested in buying your company because I want to run it full time. That was the story that I had with the burlap company. I was coming in to take over the ownership in that business. How it played out was that I decided, in partnership with the investment group, that because I had not run this type of organization before, a manufacturing business, that there were people who were in better positions to actually operate that company. And we together sourced a fantastic CEO who came from a similar industry, has an enormous amount of management experience, has been running the company enormously successful since then, and who I learn from on a daily basis as I seek additional acquisitions in the future. What that means then is because I have a significant ownership stake in NYP Corp. It's a company I own, and I own other businesses, and those businesses I've acquired as opposed to starting. That makes me, in practice, an independent sponsor. And an independent sponsor is somebody who has an enormous amount of M&A experience and private equity experience, but does not operate within a fund structure. And so they have not gone out and raised hundreds of millions of dollars, which makes them beholden to specific investment horizons that the investors who have given them that capital to hold have over that capital that they have. So you raise $100 million, you have 5 years to both return that $100 million plus a return to those investors. And there are many entrepreneurs who are interested in continuing to do acquisitions, but they don't want to be beholden to those specific timelines just for holding that capital. They're open to having those timelines over them if they own the company and they have raised that money from people when they bought the company, but they don't want to be beholden to those in a year like this year, which has been very low in M&A transactions. So very few M&A transactions relative to the previous year have happened, but you're still beholden to that timeline, and you're judged on your performance relative to holding on to that capital for that time period. And so independent sponsors instead go out and look for companies to buy in a very similar way as I do, which is what makes me, in practice, far more an independent sponsor than I would like to be.
Got it. You'd like to fall more in that acquisition entrepreneur.
That's right.
Label. Okay. That's actually a really interesting distinction. I did not, coming into this call, I'd never made that distinction before. I thought of them as synonyms, but clearly they're not. That's super helpful for me. So we did an interview maybe a month back with a guy named Steve Reardon, who leads a group called Alpine Software Group, or ASG. That would be a typical private equity group where they've got outside investors that have come in. They've got a specific investment mandate to buy software groups, and they expect to have their capital returned in a certain period of time. And Steve's job is to buy businesses with that capital.
That's right.
Your job And then there's the independent sponsor who is independent of any one capital source, who is flexible in terms of how he or she structures the deal, but does not intend to operate the business, isn't necessarily going to become the CEO. And then the acquisition entrepreneur is saying, no, I want to buy a business, run it, build it, maybe buy another business. But that's am I getting the kind of distinction between the three types of people relatively correct?
That's absolutely right.
Okay. That's super helpful. Out of interest, in some ways, the independent sponsor sounds like the more glamorous thing in the sense that it's, you can sort of fly around and do different deals and have different companies, whereas the acquisition entrepreneur feels sort of heavy, like you're going to buy one business, own it forever. Why would you prefer to be known as an acquisition entrepreneur and not an independent sponsor?
I still believe that the greatest wealth building activity you can be involved in is building a fantastic, great one business. It can have lots of different parts of it, but I think that one great business, and this has been demonstrated with how many, just go through the Forbes list from number one all the way down, maybe excluding Warren Buffett. But just going straight down the list, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos,
Carlos,
and those are just like those are just the big ones. You can go all the way down to numbers 100, 200, 300 on the list. Everyone has a fantastic core business that they built, that they own a meaningful stake in, and that's what's the significant portion of their wealth. That said, I currently am on a world tour traveling to 12 countries for 12 months as a part of this program called Remote Year. And I have businesses that provide me with capital that allow me to cover my bills while I navigate things and live a great life and see the world, that and third. And it's, it's luxurious and it's fun and I love it. I'm aware though that once we get back, the way to get this thing done where you build the type of legacy that I'm looking to build for myself is going to be to buy one great business. And I'm looking forward to making that happen. And so, even while I'm on this trip, I'm taking calls with investors. I'm having calls with entrepreneurs and pursuing transactions for the purposes of finding that one good business. And I expect to do so. So that's why.
Well, our listeners are fielding a ton of calls, sometimes as many as one or two a week. And it's hard for them to cut the wheat from the chaff, understand, okay, is this a private equity group he's calling me? Is this an independent sponsor? If so, have they got the money lined up? Is this an acquisition entrepreneur? Does he or she have the money lined? There's a lot of things for them to sort of deflect. And I think a lot of our listeners feel putting words in their mouth, but a little bit on the defensive of saying what's real here? Who can, and so it's super helpful. And I really appreciate your candor today, just in sort of decoding some of the language as well as some of the structure, because I think it's helpful for folks to go in with their eyes wide open, especially around some of this, who's guaranteeing the debt and all that stuff is important for folks to know. So it's been super helpful. I'd be remiss in not asking, where can folks reach out to you if they want to thank you for your insight, maybe connect with you?
Sure.
Is LinkedIn the best spot, or have you got a website?
LinkedIn,
yeah,
LinkedIn's great. LinkedIn.com/IN/Bakari Akil. That's I'm sure my name will be on the
we'll put the spelling and so forth at builtsolve.com for folks in the show notes.
Sure.
We'll put your link directly to Bakari Akil's LinkedIn profile. Is that the best place then, LinkedIn?
So that's one of the good places. The second place would be my website, which is 𝙁𝙊𝙐𝙇𝙊𝙀.com. If you go on 𝙁𝙊𝙐𝙇𝙊𝙀, you'll see I speak very plainly, with a lot of candor, just explaining exactly my process and what I'm looking to accomplish, and tell you exactly who I am and how it gets done. And so, that's exactly how I, try to interact with people publicly, and personally. And so, you can find a lot from me there. And my email address is always open. I'm always willing to, have a conversation with people. And so my email address is my first name at @𝙁𝙊𝙐𝙇.com. And so,
Bakari at
LinkedIn. So LinkedIn, my website, and my email address, all great places to connect with me.
Awesome, Bakari. I will put all those in the show notes at builttosell.com. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.